We now turn to Dr. Rosemary Hill, and Rosemary is Principal Research Scientist with the CSIRO Land and Water, and she's joining us today, I think, from sunny Cairns. So welcome, Ro.
Okay. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners whose lands I'm meeting on. I'm lucky enough to be here on the lands of the Irriganji and Jabbergai people in Cairns, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands that people are on today and their emerging elders and their past and present elders. I'm going to talk about how strengthening and sharing Indigenous knowledge can help create resilient communities and environments by talking about a new product that we've just released called Our Knowledge Our Way in Caring for Country. It's been quite an exciting release of these Indigenous-led approaches to strengthening and sharing Indigenous knowledge for land and sea management. And these are presented as best practice guidelines from Australian experiences. Over 100 individuals, Indigenous individuals and organisations contributed. We have Indigenous lead authors for each of our chapters, based on 23 case studies from around Australia in all of the states and territories. This was a 4-year project co-led between NAILSMA, CSIRO, the Northern Nest Hub and IUCN. For those of you who don't know, IUCN is the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and we work with the Australian Committee of that, and NESP is the National Environmental Science Program. I was one of the editorial team, which included both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and was very honoured to be able to work on this great project. What the challenge was that we were looking at is that Indigenous people now have management and control of large parts of the Australian continental landmass, and they use their knowledge in environmental management. And many government and non-government managers are starting to see the benefits of this and have an increased interest in sharing and applying this knowledge. However, there's been a long history of misappropriation and misuse, and we have a lot of examples where Indigenous knowledge has been commercially exploited, for example, in bush foods, in artwork, without consent or without any benefit flowing to Indigenous people. So the Indigenous Majority Steering Committee for this project advised us that Indigenous people must decide what is best practice in working with our knowledge. So our role in facilitating the guidelines was to give a voice to Indigenous land and sea managers about good ways to strengthen and share Indigenous knowledge. And I'm just going to show a little bit of a video with some of that voice here.
As Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, we have built our knowledge systems by learning from country over thousands of generations. We've passed down our knowledge of country according to strict laws which keep our culture strong and nurture our relationship with country. We'd like to share this knowledge with you. In the past, sharing of our knowledge with others hasn't always ended well. Mistakes have been made and lessons have been learnt. We've come together to identify ways forward. This is our knowledge, our way. The Our Knowledge, Our Way guidelines have been produced to support learning by our partners and ourselves about good ways of strengthening and working with Indigenous knowledge to look after country.
So I just want to unpack a little bit about what's in these guidelines and start by saying that it's not a recipe. Our Indigenous Steering Committee decided that they wanted this to follow the IUCN format. And this is quite a famous format globally, where they put out a lot of guidelines on different aspects of environmental management. And what is in this format is background material on key issues where you're facing something which is quite challenging, analysis of the context and the policy drive behind the need for guidelines in this area, options for action and advice, multiple case studies from different contexts which are drawn out into themes, a lot of visual material, specific stepwise processes where these are relevant, options for policy, recognition of ongoing challenges, and links to other resources. For example, some of the key issues that we have unpacked here related to Indigenous knowledge are around the governance of Indigenous knowledge, which is very important to how it can be used. We've presented material about the relationships that link Indigenous people, plants and animals. And I've often found this is quite surprising to people. We put here a couple of these relationship categories from the Fidji skin group of Fidji people in Western Australia who decided to share their skin groups. This is just part of the categories of relationships. This is one cycle of women and this is the second cycle of women. So when you're born into a classificatory relationship which determines a lot of your responsibilities, including responsibilities for some plants and animals, for places, for ceremonies. And I've just put here, for example, the Ngari skin group is responsible for the bush turkey. So we try to help people understand the way that Indigenous people see environmental relationships is quite different. There's also, of course, a huge diversity of cultures and languages in Australia. Colonisation has impacted Indigenous people and Indigenous knowledge across the whole continent, and we've unpacked some of what that's about and what the recovery from that is about. Also, why new laws are needed to protect Indigenous knowledge rights. It's not protected by the current laws that protect patents and innovations. And we also present protocols and ethical guidelines for working with Indigenous knowledge. I just want to finish up by showing you a very important diagram, I think. There's a lot of key diagrams in this publication, but this one is showing a lot of different knowledge systems here are represented by these strands. So here we have Aranda knowledge systems, we have Jaja Wurrung knowledge, we have each traditional owner groups have their own knowledge of their country, their stories, their ancestors. There's a higher level Indigenous knowledge where people generally share understanding of one another. And these have their own history, their own context, their own ways of validating what is accepted to be correct and to be truth, just as we have this in different disciplines, biological knowledge, social and scientific knowledge. And we can also recognise that practitioners have their own knowledge systems and their own way of understanding what is useful and what is true, as do technical people who are running machines. The idea that this diagram is showing you is not that we need one knowledge system to prove whether the other knowledge system is correct or not. What we really gain from understanding that there are different knowledge systems is a much richer picture of the same world. And through this richer, more complex understanding of our world, there's evidence that this underpins greater resilience and hence our interest in working across knowledge systems. I'd just like to finish by saying have a look. I think you will find that any of you who work in science, that this Our Knowledge, Our Way document is quite useful, and there's a film and a video of the launch that we did of it. So thank you very much.